up the price of them and found it 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing. Now after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, "After I've been there, I must also see Rome." And having sent into Macedonia 2 of those who were ministering to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. You may be seated.
Good evening, everyone. Sounds like this is on. So tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about New Year's resolutions. I hope we're all starting off the year strong. And a lot of times whenever we're talking about New Year's resolutions, it can be easy to kind of let it slide or be inconsistent. And I just want to give some practical applications that we can have moving forward this year. So some of these habits that we might want to form could be things like working out, doing our studies, it could be prayer and spiritual growth. And one book that I read recently is this book called Atomic Habits. And some of you may have heard of it before. The premise is that by increasing in a particular area, just 1% a day, by the time you get to the end of the year, you will have grown so much more. And it's not just necessarily adding 1%, 1%, 1%. It's building off of that previous 1% and having the exponential growth that comes with it. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And a quote from this Atomic Habits book is, "With the same habits, you'll end up with the same results. But with better habits, anything is possible." And so the way the author, James Clear, divides this book up is into 4 laws of habit building. The first one is to make your habit obvious using visual cues. And you can control the environment that you're in, like your household. You can set out your running shoes the night before so that when you wake up in the morning, you see them. You might put scriptures on your wall so that you're constantly reminded and encouraged of scripture. Maybe you leave your Bible open to a specific page that you're continuing, so you keep up with your daily Bible readings. And the key to this is just making sure that you are controlling what is going on in your own environment. One example from the New Testament is Jesus going to pray. Oftentimes you would see written that he would go and he would pray alone. And I imagine this was so that he could focus and so that he could have that quiet time with his Father. The second habit, or the second law, is to make your habits attractive. So generally, the most attractive tasks that we can perform, the things that we want to do, are the things that are going to become habits. And one way that you can go about making a habit more attractive is to do what James Clear calls habit linking. So you might start off with something you enjoy doing. Maybe it's watching a show, or it could be reading, or whatever you just enjoy doing. And then you immediately follow that up with the habit that you're trying to build, up to the point where you associate that good feeling before with the habit that you're doing, to the point where you might not even need it. Another way you can make a habit more attractive is to have accountability partners, or to do it with your friends and family. Because once you see other people in your immediate vicinity doing something, it makes you just want to do it more. The third one is probably my favorite. It's make it easy. You can kind of capitalize on your own laziness and try to reduce the amount of friction required to go do something. So I gave the example of running shoes earlier. By setting it out and having it available beforehand, suddenly you just wake up and you see them right there. Or maybe rather than having your alarm clock right by your bed and you're trying to wake up early, set it across from the room so that when you wake up, go walk over and suddenly you're already out of bed and you can get started with your day. And then the fourth habit is to make it satisfying. So with building these habits, rewards are often delayed because you don't see the immediate results coming from working out or eating healthy or maybe learning how to cook, whatever it is. If you reward yourself, and it sounds kind of archaic, but the whole like carrot stick analogy, it's pretty useful and it can be applied to each of our lives in practical ways. And the cool part about this whole process is you can make it as creative as you want. It's solely however you want to go about doing it. And if you miss a day, you just dust yourself off and move on, and you continue with it. And so this has been about good habits. So making it obvious, making it attractive, making it easy and making it satisfying. However, there are also bad habits that we might need to get rid of this year, things that we need to prune in our own lives, because nothing can stunt spiritual growth more than habitual sin or things like that. And basically, you just take all of these things that I talked about and flip them on its head. If you have bad habits, you make them invisible. You make it harder to do them. You make them unattractive. You make them difficult, and you make them unsatisfying. And ultimately, those things will help us and help you grow in our own lives. And so I hope that this can help you maximize your own year and your personal growth. I will close us now with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this day that you've blessed us with, Father. Thank you for this time that we're able to spend with one another, with family and friends. God, I just pray that moving forward this year, you would be with us. You would lead us to grow in spirit, in our bodies, help us grow with one another, Lord. And Father, that you would be our guiding light through this time. I pray for anyone out there who might be sick or in need of healing. And Father, that you would be with us and help us to grow as disciples of Jesus, that we would go out, we would spread his word. And we thank you for his sacrifice, for the blood that he shed for us. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen. You may be dismissed for classes.
All right. I think we can go ahead and get started. Everybody getting settled in. It's good to see everybody out this evening. We're continuing with our study of David and his Psalms tonight. And tonight, we're going to look at the two Psalms that are dedicated to David spending time in the cave. There are actually 2 of the 14 that find their inspiration with David living in the caves. Now, there's a couple of places that we can turn to in Scripture, in the narrative about David that talk about him being in caves. We'll look at just a couple of verses. I'm going to shorten my storytelling time just a little bit tonight to see if we can cover some more of the Psalms, because we're trying to cover two of those tonight. So turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel, the 22nd chapter. We're just going to read just a few verses as we introduce this idea of David being in the cave. So this is right on the heels, really, of David feigning madness with King Achish in Gath. And he leaves from there. Verse 1 of chapter 22 says, "So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all the father's household heard of it, they went down there to him." That's all that I want to read about that for the time being. And really, the time that I'm going to be focused on is this initial time of David finding a cave for refuge. Because as we look at the two Psalms that are inspired by the cave dwelling, it seems David is very much alone. He's experiencing loneliness like he has never experienced before. He is quite distressed. He is quite depressed and feeling a great deal of anxiety. So this time period in the cave, we have only half a verse dedicated to it in chapter 22 and verse 1 before other people begin gathering to him and he begins building his army. His family comes when they hear of it. Some time has to have elapsed from the time that he finds a cave and he's staying there by himself, alone with his own thoughts, alone with his own anxieties, as he is on this desperate escape from Saul. The other biblical example of finding David in the cave is in chapter 24. And this is the occasion you probably well remember that David is hiding in a cave and Saul is in the vicinity, and Saul chooses that particular cave to enter into and to take care of necessary business, we'll say. And as you might imagine, he has laid his robe aside, and David's cohorts at that time say, "This is your chance. This is your chance to kill the one who seeks your life." David takes his knife and he goes and cuts a part of that garment and takes it with him to show Saul that he did indeed have the opportunity to kill him. Much to Saul's shame, David confronts him about that as they communicate across these open mountains. And David does in fact shame Saul into Saul regretting in some way of his pursuit of David at that particular time. I don't think that's the event that inspires the Psalms that we're looking at tonight. We're looking at Psalm 142 and Psalm 57 tonight. So you can be turning in your Psalms to Psalm 142. We're going to start with that one. But as you think about that, just remember where David is in his mind right now. Remember what's going on with him. He is the one who was formerly in the court of Saul. He was loved among the people. He could do nothing wrong. And it's from that point that Saul's jealousy and rage toward David becomes out of control and he begins to seek his life. And so for some amount of time, and we have to say it's going to be for a considerable amount of time that David is going to spend in the wilderness. He's going to find his refuge in probably multiple caves. He's gone from the royal court to the mountain cave. And I just want you to kind of imagine that. Imagine that drastic change of circumstance for this man. He goes from being the king in waiting to being a caveman. His life is literally on the rocks. He is worried about the dangers that surround him. But what a turn of events. The darling of the nation becomes the nation's most wanted fugitive. There could be no more dramatic change of events. And as I said, it's really impossible to look at Psalm 142 and pinpoint exactly what time period this is, but it seems quite clear that here in Psalm 142, David is at a low point in his life. And you can imagine the morale of a man who has gone through what he has gone through. In fact, there are some indications in the psalm. He talks about his way and how God has seen it. He's talking about events that have transpired in his life. Samuel had given him a bit of refuge, but not really much. And Samuel, as these events are recorded, they give us some bare facts about what happens here. But when we want to know what's going on inside David's heart, we go to the Psalms. David lived in a cave, we read in 1 Samuel 22. That's all it says. You want to know how David felt about that? What emotions he was experiencing? What was going on in his heart and in his relationship with his God? You go to Psalms and you find that out. And so it's in the middle of this crisis, it's in the middle of this chaos. And I want you to think about your crisis, and I want you to think about your chaos in your life, and see if we can't find somewhere where we can relate with David. David's alone. He's alone. He perceives dangers that are all around him. He's been anointed king, but how in the world is that ever going to take place? What events are going to transpire for him to get back to the king's court where he had been previously? And so he's escaped death up to this point, but his circumstances are not good. All of this is unexpected. All of this is unwanted. All of this is seemingly meaningless. All of this feels very harmful to David personally. Maybe there is even a sense that he feels betrayed by his God. And he does begin to have pity upon himself. And you think about what he's going through and the strain that this man is under in his chaos and in his crisis. Looking back on that now, we can see God is shaping the future king of Israel. The man after God's own heart is having his own heart shaped for service as the king of God's nation, as the one who is the progenitor of the kingdom until the coming of the Messiah. But right now, he's in a cave, staring into the blackness of the cave and wondering how he's going to get to that point. What is he learning? Well, he's learning, I think, that God's ways are not man's ways. I think that he's learning that God sees and knows his predicament, and that he is going to have to put his trust upon God. Now, as we look at Psalm 142, it makes sense to consider that Psalm 142 seems to be intentionally grouped with several other psalms. We find common themes beginning in Psalm 140 and going all the way to Psalm 145. And we have Psalm 142 right here in the middle of all of that. But this is the only one that is attributed to his time in the cave. This is the only one designated as the cave psalm of this grouping. Now, what's the difference then between Psalm 142 and Psalm 57? We're going to see a little bit of overlap. However, I want you to think about this a little bit differently, and I'm going a little bit backwards about this, maybe. Psalm 142, it seems that David has settled into a routine in his cave life. Whereas I imagine Psalm 57 as the very first night of his cave living. We'll get to that and talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But Psalms 142, David is meditating upon his path and upon his way. Think about those words. We're going to read this together in just a moment. But he talks about how God sees his path, he sees his way, he sees his circumstances, he sees these events as they have transpired over this time. Perhaps he's considering everything that has led up to this point. He talks about the hidden traps and snares that have been along the way. And there's no doubt about it, his loneliness is expressed deeply in this psalm. He's had this desperate flight from the royal court of Saul. He was surveilled at his own home. He sought refuge from Samuel, Jonathan, and Ahimelech, and even Gath among the enemies of Israel, which just further complicated his life. But all of these events, as they unfold, and it seems that now his heart is just absolutely gripped with fear, isolation, desperation. In verse 3, we'll read it in a moment. I'm just giving you a little preview. His spirit is overwhelmed. Do you know what it means to have your spirit overwhelmed? I bet you do. I bet you can think about circumstances in your own life where your spirit was desolate and you didn't know which way to turn, and life was confusing and difficult. In this psalm, he expresses desperate hopelessness. He's not even sure that he will be rescued, but he's found security in a cave. But in the last verse of this psalm, he says it's more like a prison. I mean, it feels like a sentence that he has been having to live out now. And these are his new realities of his life. He is at a low point, there's no doubt about it. And it makes you wonder, is David questioning his own actions up to this point? Is he wondering whether he would have been better off just seeking the refuge of God and staying in the court of Saul while Saul continued to throw spears at him? Makes you wonder. Let's read this together and then we'll break it down into its three sections. Psalm 142. I cry aloud with my voice to the Lord. I make supplication with my voice to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare my trouble before him. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, thou didst know my path. In the way where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, there's no one who regards me. There is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul. I cried out to thee, O Lord. I said, thou art my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may give thanks to thy name. The righteous will surround me, for thou wilt deal bountifully with me. Not a very optimistic psalm, is it? You can see his desperation. I divide this psalm up into 3 sections. The first 3 verses, we have him describing his diminishing personal resources. I've got nothing left, basically is what he's saying. I've reached the bottom. In verses 4 and 5, he describes his isolation. There's nobody that cares, but his enemies still want to kill him. So he's isolated, but he still has this opposition. And then verses 6 and 7, he describes a desperate need that he has in his circumstances. And in each of those 3 sections, he gives a hint. And he does this in a poetic sense because he uses past tense, present tense, and future tense in all 3 of those sections to describe God's actions. Suggesting God was there in the past, God is with me in the present, and God is my future. But look at that with me. In that first section, verses 1 through 3, as he's talking about his diminishing personal resources, he says what? You knew. You knew. God, you saw where I walked, and you saw how I walked. Thou didst know my path and the way where I walk. You saw it back then, God. Back in the past, you observed me going to Achish and acting like a fool. You saw that. And you were with me there. And then he talks about his isolation and his opposition in verse 5. But then he says, you are my refuge. Now, present tense, you are my refuge. He previously said, I have no refuge. He corrects himself and says, no, wait a second. Right now, even in the prison of this cave, you, God, are my refuge. Present tense. And then the last section, 6 through 7, even though he's describing his desperate need and that he is in prison, he says, you will deal bountifully with me. The future is yours as well, God. So David is making an all-encompassing statement about how God is with him even in his most desperate circumstances. If I were to sum up this in one sentence, I would borrow the words of the hymn, take it to the Lord in prayer, because that is his advice and that is what he is doing. And after all, most of these psalms, if not all of them that we've looked at, that's exactly what they are. They're prayers. It's what the Psalms are all about. Prayer is the answer for David in his spiritual weariness. It is the answer as he's facing spiritual exhaustion. He's at the end of his rope. He's at the bottom of the pit. And what's the answer? Prayer. It's the answer for his loneliness. It's the answer for his hopelessness. It's the answer for the opposition that he faces. But let me tell you this. As we try to relate with David in our own crisis and our own chaos, sometimes maybe you can relate with me on this. Sometimes in our most desperate circumstances, it's very challenging to pray. It's one of the hardest things to come to terms with sometimes. Many of us, I think, experience a rather strong disincentive to pray when we feel like everything's against us, when we begin to feel sorry for ourselves. There's something within natural men that kind of embrace and wallow in their own misery for a while, right? We hold on to that dread somehow. We tell ourselves how unfair life is and how everybody is against me. When the answer all along is prayer and relying on the Lord. And somehow I think the lesson in this psalm is that we must train ourselves to fly to the Lord for refuge in these times. David, I believe, at this moment had to dig deeper than ever to find his spiritual connection with his Father. He's in the midst of this sorrow and insecurity. He has to dig deep now to find the spiritual resolve to face the danger, to face the isolation, to face the spiritual exhaustion, to seek the grace that is available through prayer, and that is what he must do. That's what I've got on Psalm 142. All right, so let's go to the other psalm, Psalm 57. I'll give you a chance, maybe, I shouldn't make that promise. I'll give you a chance to make comments in a moment. You can talk to me afterwards if you run out of time. Psalm 57. Again, as we compare these two psalms, they're both related to the cave living, but Psalm 142 was a little bit disorganized. I divided it up into 3 sections, and I think it was organized in those 3 sections, but the structure of Psalm 57 is much more meticulous. And I'm going to try to illustrate that for you with a PowerPoint slide. It has what we refer to as a chiastic structure. And it is somewhat of a song when you think about it. It's a song that has a repeating chorus. If you look at verse 5 and verse 11, those verses are identical to one another. So that is the chorus of this, where he says, "Be exalted above the heavens, O God. Let thy glory be above all the earth." So there's a bit of a mirrored image here when you look at this psalm. And I've tried to illustrate it here by these 2 columns that you see up here. And we'll read this together in just a moment. But just very quickly, in verse 1, you find that he is praying. And he's praying, and the topic is the abundant grace of God. Verses 2 and 3, he describes steady faith. And he says, "I will cry to God." Verse 4, he talks about the deadly threat posed by the enemies. And then we have the chorus of the song where God is fully exalted. Now you go around in counterclockwise fashion on my chart to verse 6, and that correlates with the enemies again. He brings the enemies back to topic. Except now the enemies are facing inevitable destruction. And verses 7 and 8 correlates with verses 2 and 3. Steady faith now becomes a steady heart, where he describes his desire to sing praises of joy to God. And then verses 9 and 10 correlates to verse 1. Abundant grace now is the abundant loving kindness and faithfulness of God. This, and then you have the repeating chorus in verse 11. This is the more you look for chiastic forms in the Bible, the more you find them, actually. This is a rather obvious one among the Psalms, where it is a literary technique that they use this comparison, this mirror image, so to speak, like this. But let's read this in its entirety together. "Be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me, for my soul takes refuge in thee. And in the shadow of thy wings I will take refuge until destruction passes by. I will cry to God Most High, to God who accomplishes all things for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He reproaches him who tramples upon me. God will send forth his loving kindness and his truth. My soul is among lions. I must lie among those who breathe forth fire, even the sons of men, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword. Be exalted above the heavens, O God, and let thy glory be above all the earth. They have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They dug a pit before me. They themselves have fallen into the midst of it. My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing. Yes, I will sing praises. Awake, my glory. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will give thanks to thee, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to thee among the nations. For thy loving kindness is great to the heavens, and thy truth to the clouds. Be exalted above the heavens, O God. Let thy glory be above all the earth. As I said earlier, I imagine, and you can see the tone of this psalm is quite different than the other. This one reflects a great deal more optimism of his situation. And that's why I kind of imagine this is the first night where David is talking himself into this situation. It's dire. I've got to live in a cave. I'm going to wrap my mind around this, and this is going to work. Is how I see David approaching this. Imagine the anxieties of the first night in the cave. This is his new life. These are his new world realities. It's lonely. It's dark. It's dangerous. Maybe he hears those lions prowling about at night. He feels insecure. But you can almost detect this sudden mood swing that occurs as he emboldens his heart. And the great shift of mood transforms from the enemies being dominant to God being dominant. He said, I'm not thinking about the enemies, I'm thinking about God. And you can almost hear his heart rate come down as he realizes this great truth. God's in control. And God is sovereign over all. And so by the time we get to the end of the psalm, the light of dawn is breaking in optimism. He is indeed in the moment of his greatest need. He's in the moment of his greatest vulnerability. But it comes to him with fresh power and fresh assurance now, even as his enemies threaten him with spears and arrows and swords. Those weapons pale in comparison with the true proportions of God's sovereignty and God's authority. And so, I look at this psalm and I see quite a difference. And from one psalm to the other, I think you can see the moods of David. As you might expect, with somebody who is in crisis, he goes from the depths of despair to the heights of glory. It seems within a relatively short period of time. I think probably we all can relate to that in some way. So what's the difference? What has changed in his circumstances from when he says, I have no refuge and everybody's out to get me and nothing good's going to happen? Okay, God, you're there, but you see all of this happening. What's the difference? Nothing has changed, but everything is different. It's a little bit ironic, isn't it? Nothing in his circumstances has changed, but everything is different. His prayer shifts from a prayer of desperate longing to a statement of exaltation and praise. It's almost an ecstatic praise of God. He sees shadows in verse 1, but that gives way to the light of dawn by the time we get to the end of this psalm. He hears the roar of lions, but that gives way to the sweet sound of the harp and the lyre as he uses those to praise his God with great energy. Prayer changes things. Again, we keep coming around to that point. And David assures his heart in that fact, and he invites the emissaries of the grace of God to come and live with him. And that's what we have to do. He comes to realize that the destiny of the evil is a demand of a downfall. And so at this moment that he is experiencing these emotions and these realities, and he has the grace of God within his grasp to see it clearly for what it really is, this is the moment that he's been waiting for, but he had to stick it out to get to this point. Is there a lesson in there for us? Hang in there. There was an older preacher that I used to have I still have a great admiration for. He's no longer among the living, but he had a catchphrase that he used with me. I think he probably told it to others as well. He said it came from his grandmother. He said he wasn't too bright in school, so his grandmother, as she sent him off to school, she would say to him, "Gary, just hang in there. Hang in there like a hair in a biscuit." And so he would admonish me, "Bruce, hang in there. Hang in there like a hair in a biscuit." I didn't know exactly what it meant either, Charlie. I typically order my biscuits hair-free. But I can imagine if you cook your biscuits and there's a hair that gets in there somehow, how do you get that hair out without absolutely ripping the biscuit up? It's vivid imagery. All right. Let me say it another way that may make more sense. Stick it out. The dawn is coming. Be assured of that. With every day you've lived your life, the dawn came. The darkness doesn't last forever. Rest in the grace of God. Wait for the dawn. Have the patience to endure. That seems to be the message of this. And I can't think of a more timely message for all of us to wrap our minds around. I have experienced some spiritual exhaustion over the past couple of years, haven't you? I have experienced some negative observations of what's going on in this world, haven't you? Has it affected you? I've seen brothers and sisters turn upon one another with terrible ugliness. How discouraging, how disheartening. I've seen fellow brothers and sisters lose sight of what really the important things of life are. And it's horrible to think about. And it's exhausting to think about. And you wonder, when are we going to get to the end of this chaos? Hang in there. The light of dawn is coming. God is sovereign. God sees our way. And He's merciful. His loving kindness is everlasting. Let's get our minds fixed on these things that David shares with us. All right. You have 2 minutes, maybe 3, to make any observations that you would like. You could ask questions, and I could defer those to somebody. Okay, LJ.
At the end of verse of Psalm 142, that last verse, after he asks that my soul come out of prison, I can give thanks to your name. The confidence, the righteous will surround me. You will deal bountifully with me. And that is so encouraging, knowing that we can pray the same kind of prayer.
Yeah. Even if David lacked confidence, he could say it with confidence. At this time, he knew that that was his future still, even though he's feeling the desperation of the moment. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we need to appreciate those 3 tenses.
His cave experience started getting better when he was in En-Gedi, because he had all his men, and he was in the inner recesses. Saul cut his robe and everything, and Saul confessed basically, "You are a better man than I." And there was peace for a little while. They went their way, but of course Saul re-engaged his old ways.
Yeah, Saul is diminishing. There's no doubt about it. He's fading from the picture. He knows the end of the story too. He just can't face the reality of it. All right. Anything else before we're finished with our study tonight? Thank you very much for your good attention.